Hello, Sales Nation. My name is Will Barron. I'm the founder of salesman.org, and welcome to the Salesman Podcast, the world's most downloaded B2B sales show. On today's episode, I am chatting with Christian Busch. He is the author of Connect the Dots, The Art and the Science of Creating Luck, and the paperback of the book has just launched today, so grab a copy from Amazon, wherever you get your books, if you enjoyed this podcast episode. Dr. Christian Busch is an expert in the areas of innovation, purpose-driven leadership, and serendipity. He is the director of CGA Global Economic Program over at New York University, and he teaches at the London School of Economics. On today's episode, Christian and I are going to be discussing if it's possible, if it's measurable, if it's possible to create luck in sales and in business and how you go about doing it. So with that, Christian, welcome to the Salesman Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm glad to have you on, mate. Okay, so let's just get down to the basics of all this before we dive into, because this topic, obviously there's going to be tons of rabbit holes. There's going to be tons that we could jump into, right? Does this luck concept that we all know, we've all experienced it, does it have an agreed upon definition? How do we define what luck actually is?
Yeah, it's interesting because when looking into that area, what I found fascinating is that usually when we think about luck, we think about that kind of blind luck that just happens to us, right? Some kind of fortuitous, coincidental, beautiful moment that somehow benefits us, right? Being born into a good family, things like that. But actually where it gets really exciting is when we talk about smart luck, when we talk about serendipity that we create based on our own actions. And so, take the quintessential moments. If you have erratic hand movements like I do, you spill a lot of coffee. And so imagine you spill coffee in a coffee shop over someone, and that person looks at you slightly upset, but you sense there might be something there. You don't know what it is. You just sense there might be something there. And now you have two options, right? Option number one is you just say, I'm so sorry. Here's a napkin. You walk outside and you think, what could have happened had I spoken with that person? And option number two, you start a conversation. That person becomes your co-founder, your supplier, the love of your life, you name it. And so it's our reaction to the unexpected. It's making the accident meaningful that turns it into smart luck. And so when we looked at serendipity, this kind of smart luck across different contexts, and then, love, business, you name it, there's always the same pattern. It's always the same, that there's this aspect of randomness, some kind of unexpected moment, but then it's about us to do something with it, to connect the dots and turn that into positive outcomes.
So I've just kiboshed all the questions out in front of me straight away. What is a gut feeling measurable? That feeling when you know someone's kind of looking at you, or you think that there's an opportunity here, and we'll dive into whether you grasp that opportunity or not, and how we create our own luck in a second perhaps. But what is that gut feeling that we label as a gut feeling, but is there a more clinical definition, or has it been researched as to what it actually is?
That's a really interesting question because, a lot of times when we kind of trace serendipity and look at it as a process, right, of spotting and connecting dots, intuition plays a huge role, right? So that sense of, there might be something there. And that's essentially trying to figure out what is the potentiality in that moment. And so the way we've been studying serendipity and the way, serendipity has been studied more broadly is really in three ways. One is to say, what's the counterfactual? So what could have happened? If I put two people into exactly the same position, into exactly the same situation that is unexpected, and one does something with it and the other one doesn't, then we see the decision point. The same is with, when we think about, a lot of my work is qualitative methods. So we go into, for example, a business incubator, and we look at what entrepreneurs over time do with a conversation we had. Like, how does that unfold? And then what happens with that? Does that turn into a particular product? So we're trying to understand it over time. But I think where it gets really interesting, and to your point, where a lot of times actually it's not necessarily just that kind of gut feeling, which can be important, but a lot of times it's mostly also about what's the way we look at the world? How do we frame the world? And there's an amazing experiment, actually, one of my favorites, and it's been replicated in different types of contexts, where they ask people, do you consider yourself to be lucky? And every listener, if you think about it, like, do you consider yourself to be lucky? And then they pick one of each. One person who says they consider themselves to be very lucky, so good things tend to happen to me, yada yada. And one person who considered themselves to be very unlucky, so I'm always in accidents, bad things happen to me. And I guess we all know people on both sides of that continuum. And so they tell those two people, walk down the street, go into a coffee shop, sit down, have the coffee, and then we'll have our conversation later on. What they don't tell them is that there's 5-pound notes, there's money in front of the coffee shop door. And inside the coffee shop, there's only one seat left next to this extremely successful businessman who can make big dreams happen. Now, the lucky person walks down the street, sees the 5-pound note, picks it up, goes inside the shop, orders the coffee, sits down, has a conversation with the businessman, they exchange business cards, potentially an opportunity coming out of it. We don't know that part. Now, the other person, the unlucky person, walks down the street, steps over the 5-pound note, so doesn't see it, goes inside the shop, orders a coffee, sits next to the businessman, ignores the businessman, that's it. Now, at the end of the day, they ask both people, how was your day today? And so the lucky person says, it was amazing. I found money in the street, made a new friend, and, potentially an opportunity coming out of it. The unlucky person just says, well, nothing really happened. And that really tells us about the power of perception, right? And the power of alertness. For example, it's fascinating how much money people drop in the street, but most of the time we don't see it because we don't expect it to be there. And I think that's what it mostly boils down to, that in this world that's kind of so uncertain, we still underestimate how likely the unexpected is all the time, and we still think we can plan things out, but actually, it happens everywhere, and we miss it all the time.
What's the difference then, especially in that might be a good scenario to build this conversation on top of? What's the difference between a optimist and someone who is lucky?
It's a really interesting question, because if you think about it like a kind of couple of Venn diagrams where similar to intuition, like it's always good to have a good intuition and a mature gut feeling rather than a naive gut feeling, right? So something that actually helps me with making decisions. So that's kind of one Venn diagram. Another one is optimism, as when you can imagine different scenarios and the potentiality of a scenario, it makes it more likely that you can actually then also act on it. But again, it doesn't have to be the way. I, for example, my amazing wife, she, is the most amazing person in the world. I know everyone would say that about their wife, but in my case, it's actually true. And so that she, she's the kind of person, she can be quite, not so positive about the world, but still she's always connecting dots, and she's always kind of making stuff happen and turning kind of lucky serendipitous moments out of it. And so it's in that way where, again, like optimism can be something that helps us to make more of it happen, but it's not a necessary condition all the time. And I've been a big fan, a lot of my life has been shaped by Viktor Frankl, and I've always been fascinated by, he wrote this amazing book, Man's Search for Meaning. And his key point always was, look, if you start as a realist, you end up as a depressionist, because the world will pull you down. So you have to start a slightly optimistic to then become the realist, the optimistic realist. And so I've seen that with a lot of the executives we work with, that they are the kind of people who have a slight optimism, but they are also extremely realistic about what's possible and what is.
Is there anything else that goes in this Venn diagram? Because it seems like, and tell me if I'm completely off on this, it could be, but it seems like almost like extraversion or confidence could fit into it as well, because maybe you see the 5-pound note, maybe you go, this is an opportunity and I could take it, and you have the intuition that it's there for the taking. But if you are, and I'm painting in broad strokes here, but if you are introverted, you might be, or less confident, you might be more bold about, if anyone sees you pick it up, they might come and complain, they might say that you've stolen it. It seems like there's other barriers to you activating on the luck that's been put in front of you, not just the fact that you've recognized it. Is there something along those lines? Is there any other elements to this Venn diagram that we should be adding to it?
Absolutely. And if we focus on three that I think are extremely important, one, it's interesting, right? Extraversion. There's a lot of hope for closet introverts like myself, in terms of that. A lot of serendipity actually comes from quiet and calm sources, right? So watching a movie and then thinking, oh my God, like people haven't talked about this, that could be a podcast, or taking this one other street to work in the morning and then keeping our eyes open and realizing in that bookstore, that book, that title, couldn't that be a podcast? Oh my God, serendipity. So I came up with a podcast idea. And so it's a lot of times serendipity can come from these quiet sources, or extroverts need introverts to kind of complement them a little bit to make sense out of all their kind of serendipity and help them filter it. So I think the first piece is really, to your point, it does help to be an extrovert, because you essentially have more conversation. So the opportunity space right, for potential serendipity increases because of the interactions you can have and so on. And we can talk more about this, especially the hook strategy, I think, where we can do a lot in that direction, even as introvert. But then also, I think you made a really interesting point about what are the self-limiting beliefs we have? What are the constraints we have that hold us back from acting on something? And I think, to me, the quintessential example is you're at a conference, this amazing speaker speaks, you have an amazing idea of what you could do together, but then you don't go to the speaker because you feel like I'm not worthy, I'm not ready, I'm not, you name it. Same in a coffee shop, right? When you think, oh my God, this could be a person I could fall in love with, but you don't act on it because you have fear of rejection or you name it, right? And I think a lot of us have this kind of inner imposter somewhere in there lurking around and saying, oh, like maybe you're not, it's not the right time for that. And one thing I found really useful in that kind of bracket of overcoming self-limiting beliefs and being able to act on the unexpected is really to think about what's the worst thing that can happen here. And I always thought the worst thing that can happen is rejection, right? The worst thing that could happen is that speaker says, no, I don't have time for you, or that person in the coffee shop says, no, I really don't want to talk with you. But then I realized the worst thing is not that. The worst thing is actually walking outside and thinking, what could have happened? Because that's the nagging feeling that doesn't stop, right? And that consumes your energy and that kind of goes on and on and on. And by that reframing, I felt like, to me, that made a big difference. And then the third aspect, really, and I think that's what I'm really excited about. So now we talked about the kind of aspect of personality traits. We talked about the aspect of, what's the kind of self-limiting beliefs. And then the third aspect is really, what are the kind of daily practices that we can use to really have more of this happen? And we can build a muscle for that. And so to give you one example, is that hook strategy that I'm a big fan of. And the idea really is to say, every time you get that dreaded "what do you do" question, for example, do you just answer, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm this, or do you cast a couple of hooks where other people could say, let me connect the dots. Oh my God, such a coincidence. Give you an example. Ollie Barrett, an amazing entrepreneur in London, if you would ask him the "what do you do" question, he would not just say, I'm an entrepreneur. He would say something like, I'm a technology entrepreneur, recently started reading into the philosophy of science, but what I'm really excited about is playing the piano. And so what he's doing here is he's giving you 3 potential hooks where you could be like, oh my God, such a coincidence. My sister is teaching on the philosophy of science. You should give a guest lecture. Oh my God, such a coincidence. We've been hosting piano matinees. You should stop by. And I think especially in sales, that's obviously where a lot of sales come from, right? These unexpected, hey, let me just tell you one more thing we just started doing, just to put it out there and then see what happens. And then that client might say, oh my God, such a coincidence. My sister just started a shop where they need exactly that kind of thing. And so I think, to me, the hook strategy is all about saying, how do we use every interaction, every conversation to cast a couple of interests and hooks in a side sentence, and then let the person pick up whatever they are most excited about.
Is this this is quite a broad question, but is this a skill that we can develop? So you just give us one direct strategy there that we all literally can use this. I will have a ponder about this, how I can use this after this episode wraps up, Christian. But is developing serendipity, I guess connecting the dots seems more logical, as I say it. Is the ability to connect the dots a skill that we can build proactively, or is this something that comes with experience of being in sales for 20 years, being in the same industry for 5, and having gone to networking events for the past 3 and shook a load of hands? Is it something that we can proactively develop, or is it something that comes with time in the game?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, right? Because when you think about something like previous experience, for example, it can help us connect the dots because we might see the unexpected anomaly in something that shouldn't be there, and by that kind of identify what's new here. But also it can give us that kind of functional fixedness, right? The hammer nail problem, that we're so used to using the hammer when we need the nail in the wall, that we're always looking for a hammer rather than any heavy object that would help us to get it into the wall. And so there's kind of like this experience can be good or bad, but in like no matter what experience we have, we can always build that muscle. And I think that's why I'm so excited about the idea of building that serendipity mindset, because it's really about saying, like a muscle, you can train a mindset. You can upskill yourself in terms of mindset. And to give you maybe 2 examples, one example that I'm a big fan of is to do a serendipity journal, where you really write down, okay, in the past, whenever I had serendipity happen, so maybe how I unexpectedly met the love of my life and then actually did something with it, right? It's not enough to just run into them. You got to go on dates and make it happen. Or how I got a client lead unexpectedly at a conference where it was about something completely different and I was there for pleasure, but actually it still, came to that. Whenever I had those kind of serendipitous moments in my life, these unexpected positive outcomes, what is the pattern behind this? What did I do that made that happen? And how can I do more of that? Is there a particular thing I do or a particular sentence I use? Whatever it is, doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. But then also more importantly, the opposite. Whenever serendipity could have happened, but it didn't. When I was in that meeting, I had that brilliant, unexpected idea, but I didn't raise it. Why? When I was in the coffee shop, I didn't talk with that person. Why? And really working then on the underlying question, what is holding me back to act on the unexpected? And that's kind of how we can remove these barriers. And then third, really, we talked about, these concrete practices. And what I found really interesting, a couple of years ago, so I used to live in London, and a colleague of mine, a very decorated, highly decorated professor, I started with his work and I told him about it. And he was like, look, Christian, I love you. I love your work, but I don't need more serendipity in my life. Like I have everything. Like I have a great family. I have a great job. Like what else do I need? And we made a deal. And we said, you know what? Just do a couple of small things, like ask one different question. Like instead of asking people, what do you do? Ask them, what do you enjoy doing? And small tweaks. What interested you about this presentation when you watch it? Whatever. Something that really went deeper into what the motivations of a person are and what makes them tick. And then essentially when you're doing this, right, what happens is you start getting more and more excited about it. And so after a month, he comes back and he's like, Christian, I didn't know life can be so joyful. And so the point here is we don't know what we don't know, right? And so what I'm excited about in this work is to really kind of like say there's particular small practices we can all do. And once we start doing a few of them, like for example, in every conversation, thinking about, can I connect Will now to one person? Can I connect them to one idea, what they told me about? When we train ourselves to constantly think about connecting dots, actually like our brain literally kind of like self-frames itself towards it. And so I think that's the beautiful thing about neuroplasticity, where we can frame both our brain, like in the kind of neurosense, but also then psychology-wise, we can actually work on our behaviors and what comes of it. And so that's, I think, at the core of this, to say, then we identify those different types of dots. And well, as last point, then you go to a fisher village in Italy and you meet that fisher woman where you thought you had nothing in common with. But now, because you don't ask her, what do you do? And she says, well, I'm a fisherwoman. You're like, well, we have nothing in common. You ask her, well, what is it about the fishing that you enjoy doing? And then she might say, well, I enjoy the endlessness of the sea. And like, that is kind of like, it gives me X, Y, Z, and it feels like an endless transition. And then I would be like, oh my God, like this is exactly how I feel about when I'm writing an academic paper, you name it, right? So it's kind of, we identify those overlaps once we start to go deeper with a person rather than assuming they're just their position or their job title.
Are you familiar with this term? Because I've not heard this term used in an academic sense, so I don't know if this is complete nonsense or not. But I've read it in plenty of books. This term of the, I think it's called the reticular activating system.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. What made you think about it?
Because it seems like a lot of what we're talking about here is pattern recognition, and
exactly.
Perhaps interesting. Can you tell us what the reticular activating system is, and then how perhaps some of that ties into how pattern recognition ties into some of this?
Yeah. Well, what's interesting, because I'm obviously not I'm not in kind of a deeper brain or other sciences, but what I am very excited and interested in is exactly the question of, we all somehow, when we're growing up, and we all somehow, when we experience the world, get used to particular patterns and ideas of the world, and we're kind of like navigating those. And then the question becomes, how do we unlearn some of that, right? So if I am used to something, that's the hammer nail problem thing, for example, right? When I have a certain idea of how I go about things and how I learn things, it's very hard to unlearn this. But when you look at, I'm extremely excited, for example, about sub-Saharan Africa, where a lot of our work is, because a lot of times when you are in a context where you have extreme resource constraints, you don't have to unlearn. Like if you don't have an ATM machine in your local village, you don't have to think about, how do I innovate that kind of ATM machine? You think about, how do I get money from my friends to the friend in the other village? And that's how unexpectedly or expectedly something like mobile banking comes about, because you don't have to think in that box you're in, but you're actually kind of thinking, okay, we're solving a particular problem here. And I think a lot of companies actually trying to do that. If you look at a company like Philips, right, they used to be organized in kind of departments. So they, you would have something like a tomography department. But by predefining the solution, tomography, you're only innovating within that space now, right? You're thinking about what can I make better as a tomography machine, versus if you step back and say, well, this is all about precision diagnosis. Tomography might be one way, but there might be 20 other ways of how to do precision diagnosis. And so if you rename the department into precision diagnosis, you give people the license to also come up with other things. And that's the same, obviously, in our own lives and how we think about how we define problems. Do we over-define a problem so to then kind of limit the potentiality for people, or do we broaden it up and allow people to connect the dots broader as well?
For sure. We see this in sales, just to drag the conversation back to that for a second, all the time of the problem is, how do we get in front of qualified customers and explain what we do and how we can help them? And salespeople have the boxes of, I call them, I email them, and then pre-COVID, maybe I knock on a door or see these people at a conference as well. And so we're all stuck in these different boxes of, there's probably 300 to 500 million salespeople on the planet, all trying to email the same executives in the same 500-600 companies, and they're all trying to do the same job, skin the cat in a slightly different way to break through. But what I like about this is that perhaps if we remove that box, and obviously it's one thing to say it, it's another thing to do it, clearly. But if you can make that happen, or let me rephrase that, there's potentially other angles, there's other dots that are there in front of us that we just haven't seen, and if we can see them, we'll have opportunities that other people won't have. We'll have that competitive advantage. So is there anything else, because I want to turn this conversation on its head slightly in a second, Christian, but is there anything else for a salesperson who's they're listening to this conversation, Christian, they're banging their head against the wall, they're just going email after email, they're not getting through to anyone, they've tried cold calling, they've tried all these things that we talk about on the show all the time, we talk about in sales books, podcasts, videos, YouTube videos, and nothing's working. Is there anything that they can do to try and pull back, unlearn some of the things that they've learned perhaps about how sales should be done, and innovate and find other dots that could be connected?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, because I think in general, and I can't speak for the hundreds of millions of people who salespeople who obviously listen to this show, but in general, when a lot of the people I work with and a lot of the people we study, I think what happens a lot of times is that they very much underestimate their own quote unquote warm social capital. So they might kind of focus on cold calling, cold emailing, whatever it is. And we all know how ineffective that's a numbers game, right? That's kind of all about having a huge pot of numbers and then hoping that one of them goes through, versus I think we completely underestimate our own social capital in the sense of, let's say I live somewhere in South London, and I have 10 people I interact a lot with. One is the shopkeeper downstairs, one is the kind of local priest or rabbi or imam, and one is the my sales partners. We might underestimate how much that local shopkeeper, for example, they might coincidentally be the brother of the CEO of Danone, or the priest might have gone to school with XYZ person. The point is, we will never know that latent social capital if we don't cast these hooks, where we essentially, in every conversation, bring in those things that actually we would like to somehow, in a way sell. So to give you one example, at the moment, one of my key purposes in life is to say, I've seen this mindset work, and I've seen it works in across contexts around the world. So I want to take that into any curriculum and company and training program that I can. And so wherever I go, being it with a shopkeeper in a local supermarket or whatever it is, I would somehow try to seed that in. And I would be like, oh, thank you so much. No, this is really exciting, because look, like, after writing a book, you can see how this is, and and now it's all about how we get this. I bring that into side sentences, and the amount of times from the most unexpected of people, again, the kind of local shopkeeper type people, would be like, oh my God, have you, like, I watched something on TV yesterday, have you like seen that this thing could be perfect for you? Or, oh my God, like my sister is actually running a local school, you should come by. And so the point really is, I think, leveraging our latent social capital, even our uncle, our sister, where we don't assume that they might know someone, but just kind of casting a couple of hooks, I think, it leads us to many more warm introductions as well.
Mm-hmm. Is there any technology that can help us with this? Because it seems like for the average Joe who's going around, plodding around the shop, obviously I'm not being derogatory towards shopkeepers here, but they're in a specific place all day, right? They are speaking to customers. Most of the traffic into the shop is going to be foot traffic going by. Maybe in hindsight of this conversation, they can influence the look of a big spender coming into the store and buying a load of food. But for salespeople, they proactively are calling, emailing, they are proactively doing this outreach. So it seems like they might be slightly more in control of their own destiny than someone like a shopkeeper. It's not the greatest example, but I'm sticking with it, Christian. Is there any way that we can use technology to, at minimum, track some of this and at best speed it up, leverage it, and multiply the effects of it?
Yeah, well, I'm a huge fan of trying to leverage the social capital of others. What do I mean with this? And that works both, offline and online. It's the idea, let's say, I don't know, it's an online event, right? Virtual event where you have this amazing speaker speaking, and then there will be a Q&A session at the end. Now, that's not your audience, right? That's their audience. But if you're the person who, kind of, in a very proactive way, kind of ask a couple of questions in the Q&A so that nobody can ignore you in a non kind of obtrusive way, but really kind of asking a lot of good questions. And then you are the one who kind of like is asked in the end to, hey, why don't you ask your question? And again, same in a physical setting, right? Like when you're in a room of 500 people, you're the first one asking the question. And then the way you ask the question is making it all about the speaker, right? Thank you so very much for this great presentation, blah, blah, blah. As someone who is looking a lot into XYZ things, so like that's where the hook is being cast, right? So that can be any kind of hook that wants to be put. I wanted to ask you the question of XYZ, XYZ. What's fascinating here is that, it's always nice to connect with the speaker, but what's mostly important is in an audience of 500 people, there's always 2 or 3 people who will come afterwards and say, oh my God, such a coincidence. Like we were just looking into like such a solution, like, can you help me out? And the point here is that's really about saying, how do I leverage the social capital of other people if I don't have it in a really smart, unobtrusive, unannoying way? It's not about pitching something. Like the moment you would pitch something at people, like they would say, oh my God, like let's get that person out of here. But if you frame it around making it all about the other person and then building in that small hook, it's amazing how often people kind of latch on that and do something with it. And I think technology, in a way, makes that scalable, right? Technology from our living room, we can dive into those different types of conversations in a non-pitchy way. But also second, I'm a big fan of this idea of Zoom and WebEx and so on being our own personal private plane, right? Like when you think about it, like when when we're speaking now, when I think about what my selling is mostly around content, right? I'm selling ideas. And so when I'm selling ideas, usually I have to fly to Tokyo to give a speech, and then I have to fly back, and that costs me 1.5 days, right? To go through customs and everything else. Now within 30 minutes, I'm there, and that's okay, and so on. And I think so to me, it's the scalability of any platform. And so that's to me less about, to me, technology is just a tool, right? But it's about what do we do with any given tool? And I think with any given tool, it's the way we interact with people. Do we interact with them in a way that's truly meaningful and casts hooks that they want to pick up, or do we just push something on them, which rarely works?
For sure. You're touching on tons of points here that I literally preach to the audience, Christian. So, 30,000 plus people will download this episode of the podcast and audio. Who knows on the video side of things? We've got some episodes that have 1,000 views, some that have got like 700,000 views on certain interviews now. I get the majority of the business that I sell over at salesman.org, which is the enterprise sales training that we do with our training product, which is kind of tying into even more what you're saying of it's an online product with backed up one-on-one training via Zoom. And if I was doing this in person, well, I need a team of like 50 people. I need 50 wills, and I don't think the world wants or needs that, right? It'd be carnage. The scale that we operate at for such a small team just couldn't exist if it wasn't for the fact of Zoom and the scale of the podcast and the fact that this year we'll be up to in 2022. We'll have interviewed over 1,000 people, 1,000 experts like yourself in business and psychology, and we've had F1 drivers on here, we've had astronauts on here. There was no way I'd get access to any of these people well, they'd see me coming a mile away and be running away before the interview even started if we were doing this in person. But that scale is unprecedented. So let me ask you this, and I've got one final question that we'll wrap up the show with. Is there a first mover advantage to connecting the dots, to building luck, to becoming what seemingly is a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy with some of this? Is there a first mover advantage in leveraging this now before all the Zoom calls, all the content in your book, this idea of look, the science behind connecting the dots becomes more and more mainstream, which it clearly will do over time?
It's really interesting because it makes me think of two things. And it's one of those questions, in my mind, it went into 20 different directions, but I'll pick two of them. And then the rest we'll discuss over a nice beer, I assume. But so the first is really around when we talk about advantage. To me, it's important to think about, right, that obviously it's a lot about structural advantage a lot of times, your serendipity base level, right? So when I look at an entrepreneur somewhere in Kenya, the starting level in terms of potential serendipity is very different from someone like me who can set up businesses because I have good networks and things like that, and everything scales much quicker. And so the base level we're starting from is very different. But then in any context, the point is that we can do something. And I've seen that in different contexts work out. And so the mindset has to go hand in hand with kind of working on structural constraints, working with governments and others on also making sure that other people, that the social inequality is being reduced. So I think that's an important point. But to your point, in terms of the way I really look at it is that the world, there's so much adjacent possibility that at any given point, there's something possible because of the potentiality of us not having thought of it. Because, if you think about it, let me give you an example. I'm a big fan of the potato washing machine. And the potato washing machine is essentially, a couple of years ago, a company, they produce refrigerators and washing machine, and they receive calls from farmers. And the farmers told them, your crappy washing machine is always breaking down. Well, why is the washing machine breaking down? Well, we're trying to wash our potatoes in it and it doesn't seem to work. And so what would we usually do? We would probably try to educate the customer, right? We'd probably say, well, that's a washing machine. Don't wash your potatoes in it. Like, it's not made for that. Our marketing plan says that we are selling like those machines for clothes. Now, they did the opposite. They said that is unexpected, but there's probably a lot of farmers in the world who might have a problem in that department too. So why don't we build in a dirt filter and make it a potato washing machine? Why am I telling you this? Because at the end of the day, there's unlimited potential for how we think about innovation and inventions offline and online. And I think, it's great that we can now do that in a scalable way, to your point, via technology, but I think we can do it in any moment, in any meeting, at any interaction. And that's why I'm so excited about that. I think you can, at any point in your particular field, be a first mover in thinking about what is the adjacent possible here that we can do about, and then cast those hooks to make it happen.
Love it. Okay, this final question for you, Christian, and this might be a whole different podcast episode or a whole conversation, 8 pints in, 3 shots and a sambuca in a pub in London, right? Is the inverse of everything that we discussed true, in that every now and again we're all going to be struck with bad luck, a bad serendipity, dots that have connected that we don't want to be connected? Is it possible to inverse everything that we talked about and perhaps see the dots ahead of time and avoid them? Does it work that way around as well?
I think it's a great question. It makes me think of two things, right? So one, bad luck happens to everyone, right? I think like that's just what it is, and that's unfortunately how life is, right? That we all have bad luck happen. We all will be disappointed by some people where we put a lot of hope in and so on. And so I think that's a given that will happen. And there's probably not that many ways around it. I'm always a big fan, similar to love. Like, if you don't embrace it, and if you're trying to be too scared of it, like, it will never really happen. And so I think, being too afraid of the bad luck that could happen will hold us back. So I think that's just a part of life. But I think the second part is to me the important one. Serendipity for one might not necessarily be serendipity for someone else. So if you take someone, if you have a dictator of a country who has a lot of serendipity happen, but that doesn't necessarily benefit their people, right? It might be the opposite. One of my favorite examples is, this kind of retired person driving in a car, and the last pleasure of their life was smoking a little bit of weed. And so they had a bit of weed in their car. A policeman had an unexpected hunch of stopping that car, stops the car, unexpectedly finds the marijuana, which was a bigger stash than expected. Great for the policeman, becoming policeman of the month for like unexpectedly identifying XYZ thing. For the retired person, of course, that's really the worst thing that could have happened to them. And so I think what happens here a lot of times is that serendipity for some person might be the opposite for the other. And then third, to your point, serendipity a lot of times, because it's a process, can turn into good or bad, right? And vice versa. The inflection point for serendipity a lot of times start in crises, right? And I think that's, to me, the really interesting thing also, that when you think about where a lot of serendipity comes from, it comes out of crises. Like, think about how you could only meet the love of your life today. Yeah.
That's a mindset though, right? You see it that perspective, but if you didn't have what we talked about so far on the show, and you didn't have the mindset to look for the opportunity in the crisis, if you were a pessimist, if you took no action on it, if you've got regrets on not acting upon it, you're not going to have what you've just described, which is taking something negative and turning it positive, which is, like, I guess, the whole point of the show, right?
That's exactly it. That I think every moment, every crisis, we have the question, does this crisis and that situation define me, or do I define that situation? And I think that is the power. You know, Viktor Frankl always said it beautifully. We can't always pick the situation we're in, but we can always, pick our response to it. He didn't never say that, but that is kind of his spirit. I think he was misquoted a couple of times about it, but his key idea behind it was to say, wherever you are, whatever situation you are, there's always something in there. Sometimes there might be no intrinsic meaning. He was in a concentration camp, which is the toughest of situations you can imagine. And he wondered, how can I still build meaning into that situation? And so one thing he did, for example, was he said, this is a situation that intrinsically doesn't have any meaning, so I will create one. So I know that I might die here. I know that there's nothing here that I can objectively do, but I can every day speak with a fellow prisoner and make them feel better about themselves. And now I have a meaning to wake up in the morning. And by doing this now, he can look back on that time and say, I had a meaningful, I made something meaningful with whatever situation I was dealt with. And I think any kind of situation I've had in my life where something really interesting happened, a lot of times came out of crisis, out of a heavy breakup as an inflection point. And then, yes, if you in the heavy breakup say, oh my God, my life is over, then life is over, because like nobody will just hand it to you. But if you kind of go through and say, look, like maybe there's someone even better out there, and that's easier said than done, right? That there's a lot of emotional components to it. I had COVID last year in a very severe way. Those kind of situations, you just feel, wow, life is over. But then actually, I think it's kind of that reframing that can help us a lot. It's sometimes easier than other times, right? And I think, again, we can never blame anyone for blind luck, and we can never blame anyone for the situation they're in, because we don't know all the aspects around it.
Love it. I love the way that, we'll wrap up with that, Christian. I love the way that this show started, numbers, quantifying this, techniques, and it's almost, because I'm not religious, not spiritual in the slightest about anything, right? But there's almost a spiritual element to this, and beyond a kind of a self-help book, Tony Robbins-esque element to this as well. Of it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy of what you look for, you're more likely to find, and then of course you're more likely to act on as well. I think that's really, I think that's serendipitous for the audience, and I think there's a ton of value there for them in this episode. So I appreciate that, Christian. With that, mate, tell us more about the book. Tell us where we can find it, and tell us where we can find more about you as well, sir.
Yes, absolutely. And likewise, I really enjoyed that, to go on those different levels, because, I grew up in Heidelberg, where Goethe and Schiller wrote a lot of their poems, and a lot of what they wrote about was about that idea of potentiality, right? Goethe would write about, if you take someone as they could be, you make them capable of becoming who they can be. And that's always been exciting to me, to say, is there something more in a situation than there is? And then kind of like, that's how, it's not only a former drug dealer who's in front of you, but a potential teacher. It's not only a former XYZ, but, so once you see the potentiality in a moment, it's almost like in a very kind of non-spiritual, spiritual way, actually about the betterment of society. And I think we can apply that to a lot of different areas as well. The book itself, it's everywhere where books are sold. It's called Connect the Dots. Penguin is publishing it. And it's on Amazon, local bookstores, and on Twitter, I'm at Chris Serendip.
Amazing stuff. Well, I'll link to that, the book, and everything else we talked about in the show notes of this episode over at salesman.org. And that, Christian, I want to thank you for your time, mate. We said this before we clicked record. I love doing these episodes. I think there's a ton of value for the audience. I get more enjoyment myself from having these conversations than I do the usual cold calling emailing, social selling side of things. So I appreciate you coming on the show. I appreciate you sharing your insights. And thanks again for joining us on the Salesman Podcast.